folks. Thanks very much for joining our Monday Mindshare this week. And what an awesome weekend to be watching the spectacle down there in Singapore of both age groupers and pro athletes competing in the PTO Asian Champs. Congratulations to our own SFuels athletes and the age groupers hitting the podium, winning some of their age groups, and also to the awesome results of the pros. Earlier this year, we did a show on a study that was showing fat oxidation happening at even very high VO2 max levels, like race level intensities. And since then, we've had a lot of feedback. There was another study that came out around the same time that we've been looking at for a while, and it even shows furthermore this suggestion that even in very high intensity, race level intensity, and this particular study I'm going to share with you and walk you through today is on UCI World Tour Cyclists and one of the teams, both in training and in racing, a multi-stage race. And the data uses fairly advanced techniques for understanding the metabolites in the blood as athletes before they begin training and when they finish training, and the same before they start a stage and when they finish a stage. And what are those metabolites telling us about the fuel and substrates they're using? And you'll find that it's really quite informative and supports exactly what we've been saying. And that is that the body and the metabolism certainly uses these different substrates at these different intensities. But like we showed in that study earlier in the year, this study too would suggest that fat oxidation doesn't seem to taper off. In fact, it may even be the most telling tale of the metabolites of what actual fuel is being used, even in this high intensity racing. And that's what this study is showing. So let me bring this up now and we'll get into walking you through it. It is actually got elements of quite technical, but what I've done is highlighted some of the simpler aspects of the study. We'll make sure we put the link to the study if you want to really drill down into it. As I said, it uses a new technique called metabolomics, and this is really looking at the metabolites in blood, and this helps us to take the techniques of studying what happens in an athlete and in respect of metabolism into real world situations, i.e. in racing. So not just in the labs, but it takes it out of the labs and looks at what happens in a training environment and also in a racing environment. It does this with 28 international elite level tour UCI athletes. And these were male athletes. It should also be done. It should be done on female athletes also, to give us that view also. But this particular study was on male athletes, and it was done both before two training sessions. One was what we call a graded exercise test, and I'll talk you through that in a second. The second was a long aerobic training session, and I'll talk you through that. And then of those 28, the coaches selected 5 of those 28 to take into one of the UCI 7-stage races, tour races. And they, during that race, took several of the stages and looked at the before and after metabolites using this metabolomics technique to understand what was going on. And, you know, at the highest level, and we'll get into the specifics of this because it's really interesting to see another proof point of what's really going on in the metabolism on this type of exercise. But they showed that in the graded exercise test, which is more of an anaerobic test, you know, 3-fold increase in the accumulation of lactates, significant elevations also even in that high intensity test of fatty acids. And something you'll see in this paper, this reference to acylcarnitines, and these are metabolites of transporting of fatty acids cross cell membranes into the mitochondria, etc. They also saw in the long aerobic session larger magnitudes of fatty acid and these acylcarnitines again, but less so reference or evidence of lactate, because mostly they were aerobic, burning fatty acids. And then when they got into the races, they saw even higher elevated levels of fatty acid oxidation, and it highly correlated to performance. And we're going to get into that exciting data in a second. So I'm scrolling through the paper here, talk a little bit about the test itself. So 28 cyclists were brought into, it's a 15-minute warm-up. This is the graded exercise test. And it started at very low intensity, sub 100 watts for these athletes. And then they began to increase the wattage per kilogram. And they started to increase that a half a watt per kilogram every 10 minutes. And they did that through to exhaustion. And then the aerobic training session was, and that was 2 days later, they took 27 of those 28 cyclists, continued to conduct this second training session, which was 180-kilometer session over 5 hours and 20. And they maintained the power output of 3 to 3.5 watts per kilo. Now, for most of us, that obviously would not be aerobic, but these are the best of the cream of the crop, if you will. And they could execute all of that in an aerobic level at 3 to 3.5 watts per kilo for 5 hours and 20 minutes. And then they had this World Tour to a stage race where of those 28 cyclists, there were 5 of those athletes selected, and they tested their blood prior to and immediately upon completion of stages 1, stage 4, and stage 6. So 3 stages within the 7 stages of the race. So let's talk about what some of these findings were. Now, even the summary, or the way that they summarize these results, metabolomic changes observed in blood vary as a function of training intensity and duration. Now, what do we say with right fuel, right time? We say that the substrates and fuels that are used vary as a function of training intensity and duration. If you look at the usage guide of SFuels, that's exactly what we're articulating. And this is what this metabolomic study is showing on UCI elite athletes. They sought to identify circulating metabolite profiles of aerobic and anaerobic exertion in the whole blood of these cyclists. So let's jump into this. So the first one on the left here is that of the graded tests. So as we said, it was more anaerobic in nature as they got into those high wattages, and you could begin to see the accumulation of lactate, the higher levels of glucose. And that was quite different, obviously, when they get down to testing the second test 2 days later, the aerobic tests, where it says the metabolic profiles were quite distinct from those observed in the 180-kilometer aerobic training session, where glucose was significantly higher in this graded test compared to the aerobic tests. Now, for the longer sessions, blood profiles of fatty acids and acylcarnitines, again, they are that intermediate metabolite that helps to transport the fatty acids across these cell membranes into the mitochondria. They differed between these 2 exercise modes as well, meaning between the graded exercise and the aerobic exercise, the amount of fatty acids and this acylcarnitines was different. And it says that long chain fatty acids accumulated, meaning that they were being moved, the lipolysis, the breakdown and making them available, they were being moved during both exercise modes, but the extent of accumulation was much higher in the 180-kilometer aerobic training session, indicated that more fatty acid mobilization was happening in that long 180-kilometer aerobic training session. Now, this totally supports just raw physiology. If you pick up a textbook and you look at exercise physiology, it will talk to that in aerobic exercise, you're going to see more mobilization of fatty acids. They particularly called out long-chain fatty acids here because that is the most predominant form of storage of fat in the body, and that is what gets mobilized here in these long zone 2 aerobic sessions. Now, what it also called out, though, is that looking at the blood after that 180-kilometer aerobic training session, higher levels of medium change acylcarnitines, meaning that, again, those transporters involved with shifting medium chain fats across the membranes was higher. Now, part of that is, it could be diet, but also as you begin to see the breakdown of the long chain fatty acids into smaller chains, they will be cut down or broken down into medium chain and small chain triglycerides. So it's not surprising then that the transporters for medium chain triglycerides also begin to rise as you begin to see the breakdown of the long chain fatty acids. So these findings, it says here, these findings support more reliance on fatty acid oxidation during the entirety of the long aerobic training session. So again, this is what we've been saying. This is what is supportive of that intensity of training. So then we get on to the metabolomic changes vary based on overall progression of the multi-stage World Tour race. So this is now taking the same techniques and looking at the whole blood and the shifts in metabolites in that blood as the race progresses during this multi-stage cycling event. And they were looking again at those signatures of those metabolites as trying to understand how the body was using different fuels and different substrates. And in here we see it references these 3 stages, stage 1, stage 4, and stage 6. These are the 3 stages that the study was looked at in terms of the before and after. Now, stage 1, for all intensive purposes, is like a time trial, 143 kilometers, 60 meters of elevation gain. So in other words, pretty much a flat course, 143 kilometers. And then you had stage 4, which was 214 kilometers. So it was the longest stage out of these 3 that were tested. And over that lengthy stage, they had an elevation of 3.6 kilometers. So quite a bit of elevation, but over a much longer length of race stage. The third stage, or stage 6, the third one they measured was this stage 6, which had 127 kilometers. So it was the shortest stage out of all of them. But in that short stage was 4,300 meters of climbing. And as was called out in this paper here down below, is that this stage 6 was the most difficult stage and elicited the largest increase in circulating metabolites. So when you scroll down, there's a lot of data and charts here, which we won't go all into, but we'll highlight here some of the interesting findings out of all of it. So firstly, one of the things actually that maybe we can just call out is that, this stage with so much elevation, and particularly, and we'll show you in a second, the latter part of the race, meaning the final part of the race, had the most elevation change and really put an emphasis on the ability of these athletes, what was their metabolism doing at the latter end of the race when it was, if you will, the toughest part of the race. And, there was increasingly the accumulation of lactate, obviously, after each successive stage in the race was actually lower. And this is really interesting because this is beginning to talk about that the use of lactate that was happening in these athletes was increasingly, the lactate was being reused as carbon or as fuel, as a substrate back into the muscle. And, we've talked about the work of George Brooks and Inigo San Miguel, who was also involved in this particular paper, highlighting that lactate can be reshuttled back into type 1 muscle fibers and used as a substrate or as a fuel. Now, there is a way to train that, and it happens through zone 2 aerobic training. That's where the training of those transporters that help shuttle lactate back in are stimulated to be able to be more capable of making that an efficient process. Of course, when it doesn't happen and the lactate is not shuttled back into those type 1 muscle fibers, of course, the hydrogen ions are released, and this is what causes this classic sensation of burning with what we say lactic acid, but essentially the hydrogen ions. Now, it also says in this paragraph, though, that meanwhile, respective amino acid products like glutamine and alanine and some of these other amino acids were also being consumed to fuel what they call the TCA cycle, basically the burning of fuels, if you will, to maintain nitrogen homeostasis, meaning that these amino acids were also being utilized. There was evidence in the metabolites to show that these were being utilized as fuel also. Now, let's keep reading here. Analysis of the relative levels of individual acylcarnitines. So again, they're those transporters that are moving fats into the mitochondria, revealed marked accumulation of these, particularly short chain and medium chain, after stage 6. So this is that hardest stage. It's the end of the race. And they saw these heightened levels of short and medium chains acylcarnitines, and with high levels of long chain acylcarnitines. So all of the transporters associated with getting fats into the mitochondria were elevated. The level of fatty acids were even more distinctly elevated after stage 6 in all cyclists, though this accumulation begins to appear after stage 4. So this is really important to understand. Again, it happens mostly in the hardest stage, but as the stages went on, this began to increase. And I think this is an important point to think about in our training, our week-to-week training, that as we have these back-to-back, particularly the big block sessions, is that your dependency on fatty acid oxidation will even further increase. Now, it says that 2 of these 5 athletes, interestingly, had much higher levels of long-chain metabolites. So this would be suggestive that for those 2 athletes, they had an even heightened ability to oxidize these long-chain fatty acids. As I said earlier, these are the most predominant forms. So these athletes were truly accessing efficiently, it's the body's own fat reserves to be used as fuel. And it said that that was partly a function of the availability of carnitine, which during the course of the race and the stages of the race began to reduce or decrease through the race. So this is a very important point. You're going to hear a lot more from us at SFuels talking more about the function of carnitine and how it should be used to be materially effective in improving this transport and this use of oxidation, use of long-chain fatty acids as a fuel, as a substrate in endurance exercise. Now, I just outline here, I do this big red square around these 3 stages, just again to put the emphasis on how much tougher this 6th stage was. So at the top here, you have this stage 1, basically flat, 143 kilometers. Then you have this most lengthy stage of 214 kilometers, and there is some ups and downs. But then you see this, shorter stage, 127 kilometers, and most elevation up and down 4.3 or 4,300 meters of elevation. So most intense. What's important, and I put this arrow here, is to note of this most steep finish of this stage 6, 7.3 kilometers, I think they talk about down here. 7.5 kilometers, 7% average grade. So, and they again were really trying to understand with that as the profile of that last stage, what happened to the metabolites and the signatures of the blood within these 5 athletes, and how could they correlate what was happening with performance relative to those metabolites. And this is where it gets really interesting. The most top correlate of performance to the metabolites was the oxidation of fatty acids, and I highlight that here in red. The fastest cyclists, 1 and 2, were those who were associated with the highest level of fatty acid oxidation. The top 10 metabolites to contribute to the clustering pattern were enriched for intermediates of fatty acid oxidation. And then it says, indeed, cyclists 1 and 2 maintain the highest level of, again, the intermediates, or this long chain acylcarnitine. So this is this transporter that moves long chain fatty acids into the mitochondria. Cyclists 1 and 2 had the highest performance, also had these highest levels of these intermediates right throughout the 3 stages, stage 1, 4, and 6. Cyclist 1, who was the top performing cyclist in this cohort, had persistently the highest levels of carnitine, the lowest levels of medium chain acetylcarnitines, and long chain fatty acids, suggesting maintenance of mitochondrial capacity and fatty acid oxidation throughout the race. So this is highlighting that even though the intensity was rising, they could continue to burn fat more and more at these higher intensity levels. In support, this cyclist, who also finished stage 6 with the lowest levels of glycolytic intermediates, i.e. lactate. What is this saying? What this is saying is that these athletes were more, this particular athlete, who was the fastest athlete, was using more and more fat as fuel through this most difficult stage. And in that most difficult stage was the metabolites would suggest had the lowest levels of the breakdown of glucose and therefore the production of lactate. Now, we don't talk about this enough when we talk about right fuel, right time. And that is, as much as we talk about being able to raise the use of fat as fuel at higher intensities, we probably don't say enough about that when the body is doing that and not burning as much glucose, remember that by not burning that much glucose, it is not throwing off that lactate because it's not using the glucose. The lactate does not come from burning fat in as fuel in this high intensity performance. So this is really important because I think we see a lot of athletes struggling with the concept as when the latter end of the race gets tough, the interpretation of, if you will, the pain that comes with the higher intensity and just the length of the duration of the race, it's interpreted that I'm running out of fuel. Where in fact, what is happening is the overconsumption of lactate, the overconsumption of glucose, the heightened production of lactate. It's like this spiral of interpreting that as not enough fuel, take more glucose, produce more lactate, and so the downward spiral begins. Now, one final really interesting point they found with this #1 cyclist who had the highest level of performance, the highest level of fat oxidation, the lowest level of glucolytic metabolites, lower levels of lactate. They also found that this cyclist had the highest levels of reduced oxidized glutathione. Glutathione is an antioxidant, and methionine, which is also an antioxidant. This is suggesting of the highest antioxidant capacity throughout the competition among all cyclists that were monitored in this study. This is a really interesting finding. There's been talk for a long time about the effect of more cleanly burning fuels and substrates in the context of burning more fat rather than glucose, being It's a cleaner form of oxidation for fuel, and it releases less oxidation of, if you will, other metabolites of exercise. Those metabolites can throw off, of course, factors and metabolites that will chew up, if you will, antioxidants. And what this was suggesting, it showed the highest level of reductions of those antioxidants, meaning that the pool remained higher of antioxidants. And that is seen in the athlete that was far more burning fat than glucose, even in this, world-class, toughest stage of the race. It's almost the end of the total stages. It was the 6th out of 7 stages, still burning ton of fat in the highest, most intense part of the race, lowest lactate, and also remained and retained, I should probably say, the highest antioxidant capacity. So I think this is just a real breakthrough study. I think the use of metabolomics, we're going to see a lot more of this to really understand and show what is happening in athletes as intensity shifts in training and racing, and how the body is selectively using these different fuels at different times. And clearly we can train the body to use more of its reserved repository in long chain fatty acids, and in that process reduce the lactate output and also reduce the amount of drawdown on antioxidant pools. I think this is fascinating. It all points and supports to what we've been saying at SFuels around right fuel, right time. I hope you found that interesting, folks, and I wish you all the best in this week as you go longer in your training and racing. Have a good one, and like always, go long.